Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland. Tonight we're going to cover part 2 to a video I did 6 months ago. Of course, I'm talking about the video, Did Paul McCartney Die in 1966? Now, in that video, I covered the premise of the story and the clues that were included on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Tonight, part 2, the clues after Pepper. All right, so it's important to remember when all of these clues started to surface. They started to surface on Russ Gibbs' radio show back in 1969, October of 1969. And a listener identified only as Tom called into the radio station and suggested that Russ and his listeners listen very closely to certain Beatles songs because he said there were clues that Paul McCartney had died. A month before that, Tim Harper had done an article entitled, "Is Paul Dead?" for his college newspaper, and it was even published in the Chicago Sun-Times. Hell, an audience member, while The Tonight Show was taped, yelled out, "Paul is dead," at the top of his lungs, and it wasn't long before even Alex Bennett, famed New York DJ, got into the scene. We talked about this in my last video. And by the way, if you haven't seen that video, I'll be sure to pin it up here on the corner. It's in my description box, and you can take a look at that video after you watch this one. And you know what? It was in that video we talked about that even F. Lee Bailey, famed lawyer, who never met a television show he couldn't guest star on, got involved and conducted a mock trial on television. You know, I remember this time period, and it was the scuttlebutt of the school. Every girl was drawing on their notebooks pictures of Paul and all of that. Paul is dead this, Paul is dead that. The word was out. Now, the basic story goes that on November 9th, 1966, Paul McCartney and the Beatles were at Abbey Road Studios recording. They got into an argument, a heated argument, and Paul McCartney left in disgust in his Aston Martin, picked up a young girl named Rita, that's right, lovely Rita, and proceeded to get into a deadly car accident in which he was killed. Matter of fact, some say even decapitated. This led to the Beatles and British intelligence to handle this emergency because they just knew that once the word got out that Paul McCartney was dead, fans galore would lose their freaking minds. So rather than all of that nonsense happening, they decided to put in a ringer. One William Campbell, a winner of a Paul McCartney look-alike contest, stopped touring and just become a studio band with George, John, and Ringo supplying the music and William supplying the face. Right around this time, the Beatles started making films to tour for them instead of them having to show up on TV shows all over the planet. Such films included Rain, Paperback Writer, Penny Lane, and Strawberry Fields Forever. In the earlier videos, fans noticed that there was something wrong with one of Paul McCartney's teeth. It didn't stay in place during the whole video. Of course, Paul would later explain he was in a moped accident and had chipped his tooth and was using gum to shoot that video, and he was always having to play with it. But that didn't stop fans from thinking something was up. Now, some thought that the Beatles had nothing to do with this, but that maybe, just maybe, it was the powers that be, their management team, that was conducting all of this from behind the scenes. Of course, it didn't help when Life magazine in November of 1966 put out an issue with Paul McCartney and his family on the cover, but if you held the cover up to the light and looked at what was on the other side of that, you'd see a car ad. The car blocked Paul McCartney's body, only leaving his head, leaving some fans to speculate that this was yet another clue that Paul McCartney had been decapitated. Now, why would anybody even fall for this idea? Well, it was the 60s, first of all, and we had already seen bands such as the Beach Boys when Brian Wilson decided to stay behind and work on recordings and songwriting. They brought on Glenn Campbell and Bruce Johnson to take his place for their live performances. What was so different about the Beatles secretly just having a face on hand with John, George, and Ringo still supplying the music? And yet some fans still remained unconvinced, thinking that the Beatles were supplying us with hints on the artwork on their albums and in the lyrics to their songs. Some fans reached back to Yesterday and Today, the album For America by the Beatles that had the famous Butcher cover, and the picture that was pasted over that seemed to indicate, especially if you turned it on its side, that Paul was lying in a coffin. Those same fans pointed out that on Rubber Soul, while the other Beatles are relatively facing forward on the cover, Paul is notably facing sideways, thus pointing him out as an exception. But why? Many felt it was a clue that he had passed on and that they were letting their fans down gently. On Rubber Soul, the title alone was a clue that whoever this Paul McCartney was, he wasn't the real soul. He was a rubber soul, a rubber-stamped replacement. On Revolver, Paul McCartney's drawing is facing away from the Beatles, another clue evidently, with the only problem on these albums being is they were released before Paul McCartney supposedly died. But what about those songs? With over 30 songs that some fans claim that have clues pointing to Paul McCartney's death, some fans questioned as to whether the Beatles were doing this themselves, whether they were involved in passing these clues on. Songs like Revolution Number 9, it starts off with an engineer saying number 9, number 9, number 9. And this repeats 13 times. They noted that Paul McCartney had 9 letters in his last name, and the fact that they repeated this sentence 13 times indicated that it had to be Paul McCartney, because Paul McCartney is 13 letters. And could that number 9 indicate November 9th, 1966? With apocalyptic sounds and the sound of flames and a voice screaming, "Let me out," you almost feel like this was a purposeful collage by the Beatles addressing these very rumors. And when you played the beginning of that record backwards, number 9 became "Turn Me On, Dead Man. Turn Me On, Dead Man." On George Harrison's Blue Jay Way, when he sings "Please Don't Be Very Long," when you play that backwards, evidently it says Paul is bloody. Paul is very, very bloody. And on Strawberry Fields Forever, John seems to claim that he buried Paul. Never mind the fact that John said, "I said cranberry sauce," and the fact that you can clearly hear cranberry sauce on the anthology outtakes. But you can't blame fans for trying. After all, in the same song, John used Morse code to tap out the name John. So there were shenanigans by the Beatles at times with these lyrics. Sometimes, though, these were just coincidences. So whether this was an accident or not, the Beatles were known to get mysterious and put very strange things on their albums. And it doesn't stop there. A Day in the Life, John talks about somebody blowing their mind out in a car. This seemed to be exactly what the rumors were indicating. Paul blowing his mind or losing his head in a car accident. Sgt. Pepper included Lovely Rita. We've already talked about that. On She's Leaving Home, we get an indication of exactly when Paul died. 5 a.m. on Wednesday morning. Incidentally, November 9th, 1966 was on a Wednesday. Some fans felt that Drive My Car was a reference to the accident and Paul picking up Rita. Come on, baby, you can drive my car. The hardcore clue finders were including songs like I'm Only Sleeping, Dr. Robert, Yesterday, and Act Naturally, all part of their clue base. The Beatles trying to act naturally even though Paul was not with them, so as to not get anybody suspicious. And of course, Dr. Robert was the guy who signed Paul McCartney's death certificate. These kinds of fans said that We Can Work It Out was the deal the Beatles made between themselves and management. I mean, this whole rock and roll mystery had everybody buzzing back in the day. Some included the run out on some versions of Sgt. Pepper where the Beatles appeared to be saying that they will blank you like Superman. They said this was the Beatles hinting that they were screwing their audiences over. Now, these kinds of clues need a whole lot of supposition, don't they, folks? But there were other songs like Revolution that had a little bit more to them, almost to the point that you kind of got to wonder if the Beatles weren't screwing us over a little bit here. In 1995, Paul McCartney, after all, admitted that they were tacking stuff all the time on their recordings. On I Am the Walrus, the title is actually I Am the Walrus, No You're Not, said Little Nicola. When you compare that to Glass Onion and him saying, here's another clue for you all, the walrus was Paul, that title takes on a whole different complexion, doesn't it? Stupid Bloody Tuesday, mentioned in that song, is the night the Beatles got into the fight, and by the time Paul McCartney left, it would be Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock. Paul being in a car accident takes even on more weight when you consider that on I Am the Walrus, John wrote the basic portion of that song around 2 notes. The 2 notes he heard while an ambulance, an English ambulance, passed him by. On Only a Northern Song, George Harrison admitted there's something not right in the song. That's part of the lyrics, admitting that the band's not sounding quite right. Some have claimed that in the nautical portion of Yellow Submarine, you can hear John saying, Paul is dead, and even elsewhere repeating the word dead man. With parts of the song on All You Need Is Love where John seems to be indicating or supposing that Paul is dead there, as soon as that portion comes in, on view comes the word no, right in front of Paul's face. In the film Magical Mystery Tour, Paul is the only one wearing a black rose, right? The rest of them had red. Now, Paul has said that that was all they had left. I've kind of got to wonder about that. How many people have a bunch of black roses hanging around? It's not a common color, but that's the story, and they're sticking to it. Ringo told us that he was in a car crash and that he had lost his hair. According to the rumor, he had lost more than his hair. He lost everything his hair was attached to. Now, on the White Album, you have I'm So Tired and then Paul McCartney's Blackbird. As I'm So Tired in, you hear mumbling at the mic. When you play that backwards, you hear Paul is dead, miss him, miss him, miss him. With Blackbird following that, What is a blackbird if not a raven, and isn't that a macabre symbol of death? John tells us on Come Together that 1 and 1 and 1 is 3, indicating that there were only 3 Beatles left. Now, the artwork on the albums that would be up for debate, for example, Magical Mystery Tour, has the Beatles pictured on the cover in animal costumes. Of course, we're told later that the walrus was Paul, but clearly the walrus is John. In the 24-page booklet, there's tons of art that indicate that's where we see the black rose with Paul. That's where you see the photo of Paul sitting at the desk and the sign, I was, right there for us all to see. On pages 10 and 13, Paul is not wearing any shoes. We'll get to that in just a moment. Ringo's drumhead says, love the 3 Beatles, indicating that one of the Beatles are no longer on board. If you took this album cover, turned it upside down, held it to a mirror, and squinted your eyes, tapping your heels 3 times, saying to yourself, there's no place like home, you could see a telephone number where you could call and find out all the grisly details. Again, Revolver, although released a little too early, seemed to have plenty of death clues. Paul singing, I was alone, I took a ride. John singing, for Paul, I know what it's like to be dead. Get to the White Album, it's all in the photos and the poster. Paul's photo out of the 4 is once again different, much more detailed and close-up than the other 3 Beatles. Paul's lying in a tub with only his head there. Again, evidently, another clue as to his decapitation. One photo shows ghostly hands hovering over Paul, and there are a plethora of photos on many Beatle photos where hands are extended over Paul's head, evidently indicating death in some sort of way. And we're not even going to get into Manson's theories on the Beatles. That man has gotten enough press for 3 lifetimes. Of course, on Abbey Road, the Beatles appear to be walking in a funeral procession. John being the minister, Ringo the pallbearer, Paul being the dead guy, with George following him in work clothes as the grave digger. A Volkswagen Beetle in the background with the license plate 28 if indicates that Paul would have been 28 if he had lived. Never mind the fact that at the time that photo was taken, that Paul McCartney was 27 years old. Paul is out of step in that photo. He's also got a cigarette in his right hand. That happens in several photos, one on Magical Mystery Tour. Paul's left-handed. On the back, we have the Beatles there on the wall with a crack running through the S, indicating to some clue hunters there was trouble in paradise. They also point to the pop marks on the wall that if you trace it, it makes the number 3. Never mind the fact that you can trace it and make the number 8 or 5 quite easily. You know, the 60s were a magical time, and we saw such a miraculous amount of music coming forth that it wasn't hard to believe that the really weird could happen. And it speaks of the Beatles' mythology here. Their myth is so strong that this rumor persists even to today. I know some of you have written me and told me you believe it. Hell, this whole death clue even made it into an issue in Detective Comics of Batman, where Batman has to find out if Saul Cartwright is dead or not. Turns out it was the other 3 that were dead. Saul was just fine. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed the video tonight. It was fun putting this one together, but boy, I have a zillion notes on this. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. That helps the YouTube algorithm better, send this thing out to a wider audience. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel as of yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. It's so damned easy. All you have to do is hit that subscribe to the tribe button, then tap that top bell icon, and you'll be notified of all of my future videos as they come out. All right, folks, let me know. Did I miss any death clues? I know I must have. There are hundreds of them out there. Let me know in the comments. All right, I'm Michael Noland. This is The Bottom Line. And together, folks, especially in those comments, we are the tribe.